Good evening. I'm Darrell Hart. I serve on the Christian Education Committee of the Presbytery. Welcome to the, I can't say fall conference. It's not fall yet, right? But the Indian Summer Conference of the Presbytery, and we're here privileged to have Camden Bucey speaking on, as you can tell, oh, it was up there, the importance of Van Til for today. Camden probably does not need an introduction. I forgot to check how many Twitter followers he has, but that may not be relevant to our concerns. I don't know how many people here are on social media, but he is a graduate of Bradley University with degrees in business, computer systems, and an MBA. He worked in the private world for a while. Then he went to Westminster Seminary for an MDiv and also for a PhD. He became a minister in the OPC in 2013. Was the pastor at Hope Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Grayslake, Illinois, and 6 years later he transitioned to become the executive director of Reformed Forum. He also holds the title of historian of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. He is married to Erica, and they have 3 sons, all of whom are here. So I'm going to turn it over to him, but there will be time for questions and answers afterwards. I know the script that Camden has, and we should have plenty of time. Please welcome Camden Bucey.
Thank you, everyone. It's a joy to be here this evening. I love the great state of Michigan, and any reason I have to come and to bring my family is certainly one that I'm going to take. So it's a pleasure to see many friends and to meet new ones and make new ones, and I'm very thankful to be here. The last time I was in this congregation was worshiping on the Lord's Day, I believe in the 2014 General Assembly. We were driven here by buses on a very hot day, but it was a wonderful and a refreshing day to come and to worship with the saints here at Harvest, and I'm thankful for that. I do bring greetings, not only from Hope OPC. We love you dearly. We pray for many of the people over here, and we have family members that are over here, but also from the Presbytery of the Midwest, which is still enormous, even though we're about half the size of what we used to be a couple years ago before we split. We just recently had our meeting last week, and things are going well. So we're very thankful for that. I do want to give thanks also and express my appreciation for the Presbytery, but also the Christian Ed Committee, and especially Darrell and David for the invitation to come speak and to speak on the importance of Van Til today. Now, I'm a Van Tilian. I love Cornelius Van Til, but this was presented to me as the topic, and I'm happy to bring this. So it's a very special day for a Van Tilian, because usually we have all these ideas about Van Til that we want to impress upon everyone, but we have to go find the audience for it. So in this case, I was asked to come speak on Van Til, so it's making my day, and I'm happy to do so. But we're going to do so from perhaps a different angle. Obviously, Van Til is well known for his apologetics, his contribution to what many people have called presuppositional apologetics or covenantal apologetics. I just like to call Reformed apologetics, but that's perhaps being a little bit polemical. But we're going to look at him more holistically tonight. I hope we will see and learn from the life and practice of Van Til, just his example of being a faithful churchman and a servant of Jesus Christ. You know, in the sphere of I should say there are handouts, and I think many of you have them, but there's just a one sheet that has a front and a back. If you don't have one, then you can look around. There should be a stack of them somewhere, or we can make additional copies. So if you just read that quickly and you get bored with me, like all the documents and everything are there, you can find out, and it appears that this may be being recorded as well. So hopefully we'll have a good time tonight and time for questions and answers. Please write down your questions, and I'll do my best later to answer them. But in the sphere of our ecclesiastical history, and I mean that in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and its impact on the wider Reformed community, few figures cast as long a shadow as Cornelius Van Til. He's known outside the bounds of the church, widely outside the bounds of the OPC. But he's mostly known, as I mentioned, for his contribution to Reformed apologetics, having, drawing from the best of old Amsterdam and old Princeton while avoiding several of their theological and methodological weaknesses. That Van Til has had a significant influence on the discipline of apologetics, whether you like it or not, it's undeniable. Yet I would like to focus on his influence this evening and importance, specifically upon the Orthodox Presbyterian Church in other areas. His steadfast dedication to confessional faithfulness, a distinctly Reformed witness, and a robust and orthodox doctrine of God has made an indelible mark on the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, while also influencing a range of evangelical theologians, people outside the bounds of our denomination. And his relentless commitment to theological integrity amidst the tumultuous landscape of his era provides a model for navigating the equally challenging realities of the 21st century. And so in this address, we will explore the enduring relevance of Van Til's work and thought, analyzing his theological contributions against the backdrop of his historical context, while looking at and considering the application and the resonance of those lessons for our own day. So tonight our exploration begins with Van Til's staunch commitment to confessional faithfulness, a conviction he held in common with the seceders of the 19th century Dutch Afscheiding. And next we will consider Van Til's efforts to maintain a distinctly Reformed witness amidst a rapidly changing cultural and ecclesiastical landscape. In particular, we'll spotlight his role in the Committee of Nine, which set the course for the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and its relation to the nation and to the broader evangelical cultural movement in the 1940s. And then finally, we will probe Van Til's doctrine of God, highlighting his unwavering commitment to classical theism, according to the ecumenical creeds and the Reformed confessions, his relentless critique of what he termed correlativism and pantheism challenges several contemporary theologians, even those who may identify themselves as Van Tilian. So my intention tonight is not just to pass on some little historical facts, although you'll get some of those, but my intention, at least, whether I am successful or not, remains to be seen. But it's to help guide you past the fervor, past the factionalism that often cloud the legacy of Cornelius Van Til, and allowing you to appreciate his significant role in the formation and the development of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, which extends far beyond his contribution to Reformed apologetics. We can't discount his contribution to apologetics, but his influence is much wider and broader than that. So first, let's consider this notion that Van Til was confessionally faithful. To back up and think a little bit about his biography, if you don't know, he was born in the Netherlands in 1895 and immigrated to the United States at a young age. Brother Ipema is teaching down at Mid-America Reformed Seminary. I have, if you want to see later, the location of Van Til's childhood farm on my Google Maps. So you can go there if you want. There's a CVS right there. So eventually some of that land was sold, and one of his, I think it was his cousin, it was one of his brothers, got involved in the grocery business and then went into a partnership with Strack, I think, and you'll find a whole chain of Strack and Van Til grocery stores in the area that is mildly related to Van Til and his history. And there is a Strack and Van Til grocery store near where Van Til's house was. I presume it had something to do with that land changing hands over the years and eventually ending up in the corporate the corporate world. But Van Til was lived not too far from here. He was a product first of the Dutch Reformed tradition, but later and eventually of American Presbyterianism, which provided him a unique lens to view his turbulent times. The early to mid-20th century, you see, marked a period of increasing secularism and what we call modernism within Christian denominations. Churches grappled with the growing popularity and influence of scientific naturalism and higher criticism of the Bible, which sought to reinterpret or even outright reject traditional Christian doctrines. And these influences led to a growing divide within many denominations between those committed to the traditional confessional faith and those advocating for a modernist interpretation or reinterpretation of Christianity. And this divide was particularly acute within Presbyterianism, culminating in the Presbyterian conflict, which we might say is an ecclesiastical cousin to the broader fundamentalist modernist controversy. They're related, but not identical. And the Presbyterian conflict began even before the modernist fundamentalist conflict, you may say. Professor Hart has taught on this in a course on J. Gresham Machen that we recorded, last year? Or was it, just last year. Well, Van Til's career straddled this very complex period. And he began his teaching career at Princeton Seminary in the late 1920s, which was a time when the seminary was still holding to its historic defense of conservative Presbyterianism. However, a shift in leadership and ideology at Princeton led to the formation of Westminster Theological Seminary in 1929, a new institution committed to confessional Reformed theology. Van Til was among the founding faculty of Westminster, of course. This is a history many of us know very well. And if you don't know it well, there are many publications we could recommend that you can read. But Westminster was firmly committed at the time to this confessional identity. And it underscored Van Til's commitment to a traditional confessional faith. You see, for Van Til, the heart of Christianity lay in its historic confessions, ultimately in the Bible itself, but expressed and summarized in the three forms of unity, as well as the Westminster Standards. For him, these confessions served as a doctrinal anchor, a safeguard against theological drift. They defined the contours of the Christian faith and the church's identity, ensuring a continuity with the historical Christian tradition and with the teaching of Scripture. Van Til's commitment to confessional faithfulness was not just a theoretical stance for him, but it was deeply rooted in his heritage. His understanding of confessional faithfulness was profoundly shaped by the Afscheiding, which was a 19th century secession movement within the Dutch Reformed Church. The Afscheiding, many of us Americans or German influenced might be tempted to say Afscheiding. Don't do that. It's embarrassing. It's Afscheiding. It's Dutch. Don't offend your Dutch brothers, especially in this area. You don't want to do that. The Afscheiding, or the secession, which began in 1834, deeply influenced the Dutch Reformed Church. It became a significant historical touchstone for Van Til's tradition and for Van Til himself. Originating in Urum, a small village in the Netherlands, the secession was a response to the perceived liberalization and increasing state control over the church. Led by a man named Hendrik de Kock, the village pastor who experienced a transformative shift in his own understanding of Reformed doctrine, the seceders considered these trends as betrayals of the church's historic confessional faithfulness. The reaction led to a profound theological and ecclesiastical divide, culminating in the formation of a separate Reformed community, another church. And by the late 17th century, the Dutch government had begun to interfere in church matters. And this interference escalated when King William I returned from exile and restructured the government as a constitutional monarchy. But despite lacking a deep understanding of Reformed doctrine or polity, the king sought to merge the Lutheran and Reformed churches and reorganized the church's governance, violating what had been the established church polity. Later, the Afscheiding began when Hendrik de Kock, initially unfamiliar with Reformed doctrines, you need to know that, this is an ordained minister who did not understand anything about the church's own confessions of faith. He was unfamiliar with Reformed doctrines. He experienced a transformation in his ministry after reading the Canons of Dort, which had been given to him by one of his congregants. He was the minister. And as one of his congregants gives him the Canons of Dort, and lo and behold, his mind is blown. He is changed. And his preaching, deeply rooted in the doctrines of divine sovereignty, began to attract a large following, even from regions as far away as Friesland. And controversy erupted when de Kock agreed to baptize children from other congregations whose parents did not feel their local churches taught sound doctrine. Probably not a good idea to do that, but sounds new-sidey. But this was what happened, and this led to de Kock's suspension from ministry, a move executed without the required quorum, but still upheld by the provincial and synodical boards and even the king. Now, amidst these struggles and the loss of his daughter at the time as well, Hendrik de Kock and his consistory facilitated the act of secession or return. Finding their theological rationale in the Article 28 of the Belgic Confession, 247 individuals joined this newly formed church, separate from the state church. And the secession was seen as a return to the confessional standards and form of subscription established during the Synod of Dort. So they saw themselves as a continuing church. But within the Afscheiding, there was a noticeable geographical divide in the theological emphases of the seceders. See, in the South, the movement was heavily influenced by pietism, similar to German Lutheran pietism, emphasizing personal conversion and a vibrant experiential faith. These seceders were concerned about what they saw as dead orthodoxy within the church, where confessional faithfulness became mere intellectual assent, devoid of personal faith and transformation. Many of the same themes we see in American Presbyterianism at the same time, right? But in contrast, the seceders in the North placed a greater emphasis on confessional orthodoxy. They saw the confessions as a vital safeguard for the doctrinal purity of the church, protecting it from heterodox beliefs and practices. You see, for them, confessional faithfulness was not a barrier to personal expressions of faith, but was integral to it, providing the theological framework within which a genuine faith was nurtured and expressed. So in drawing parallels with the Afscheiding, Van Til saw the importance of maintaining both aspects within the church. Like the seceders of the Afscheiding, Van Til sought to maintain the integrity of the church and the faith in the face of significant cultural and ecclesiastical pressures, demonstrating the enduring relevance of the Afscheiding as a model of confessional faithfulness. The degree to which he might have leaned on the northern or the southern interpretation perhaps is for another day, but definitely Van Til was sympathetic with many of the aspects that were expressed and demonstrated by the seceders in the Netherlands. We also need to consider J. Gresham Machen at this point as well, and his influence not only on the movement, but on Van Til. Machen significantly impacted Cornelius Van Til on this front. Machen's contention is well known. This is the year of Machen. We celebrate the 100th anniversary of the publication of his perhaps most important book, Christianity and Liberalism. Machen contended that liberalism was not a minor theological squabble over doctrinal nuance. Rather, he saw it as a fundamental departure from the historic Christian faith. Liberalism was another religion altogether, not just a different form of Christianity, but a different religion. And just as the seceders of the Afscheiding movement discerned the secularization of their church in the 19th century, Machen, in his era, perceived liberalism as a capitulation to naturalism, a worldview that excluded the supernatural, that God did not interact with or was not involved in history. And therefore, the miracles, the works of Christ, Jesus' own divinity, none of this is actually literally true for the liberal. Both the Afscheiding and the formation of the OPC were reactions against a perceived, but a real, departure from the historic Christian faith within their respective denominations. And in both cases, the proponents of these movements believed that the confessions were not merely historical documents, but living expressions of the church's faith that are grounded in the Word of God, summarizing the teaching of Scripture. As such, any significant departure from these confessions represented not merely a breach of tradition, but a breach of faithfulness to the Bible itself. And in the tumultuous period leading up to the birth of a new church, our church, the OPC, Cornelius Van Til found his voice in the pages of De Reformatie, which is a publication in the Netherlands. His articles, written during this critical juncture, serve as really a fascinating window into his thoughts and his convictions at the time. He was just about 40 years old. They illuminate these letters that he wrote in Dutch back to his countrymen from whence he came back when he was 5. They illuminate how Van Til functioned really as somewhat of a bridge connecting the Dutch Reformed tradition and the American Presbyterian one. In one provocative article, I've got a footnote there, you can look it up. There was a provocative article he published in October 1935. So put that in your minds in terms of what's going on in the Presbyterian Church, USA, October 35. So the OPC was founded June 1936. So just before this, not even a year before this, he wrote an article titled Afscheiding in 1936, ? Cornelius Van Til drew a clear and forceful parallel between the struggles faced by the Orthodox Presbyterian Church in the 1930s, what would become the OPC, and those of the Afscheiding in 19th century Netherlands. The first line of his article poses a rather poignant question. He asks, will an Afscheiding, that's the word he uses, will an Afscheiding have to come in 1936? He's intentionally linking his current experience in the Presbyterian Church USA with the history from his Dutch heritage beginning in 1834. And as Van Til wrote, this question divided even conservative groups within the Presbyterian Church. Many people had different ideas on how to answer that question. Is an Afscheiding necessary? Well, even conservatives disagreed on how to answer that question. Those like J. Gresham Machen and his supporters, which included Van Til, believed that secession was nearly inevitable and necessary. But on the other hand, there were those such as Samuel Craig and his supporters who believed that secession was neither advisable nor necessary. Conservatives, they were not modernists, they were not liberals, they were not moderates either, necessarily. These guys, many of them, were on the board at Westminster Seminary, but yet were not willing to support a new church. They were willing to support a new seminary, but not willing to support a new church at that time. Well, the difference of opinion between these two groups underscores the deep divide within the Presbyterian Church USA then. To Van Til and those who shared his view, the church had strayed so far from its confessional roots that a new Afscheiding seemed the only viable solution. And much like the seceders, they pushed forward even in the face of much adversity and suffering. Certainly after Machen his appeal at the Syracuse General Assembly was denied, and several others in the cause were also removed from ministry, it was absolutely necessary. When they called for a meeting of the Presbyterian Church Constitutional Covenant Union in June 1936, that ended up becoming the first General Assembly of what was called at the time the Presbyterian Church of America. Afscheiding was necessary in their mind. But this whole historical moment demonstrates something about Van Til, I believe. We see his confessional faithfulness and his willingness to fight for confessional fidelity, even in the face of suffering and persecution. They suffered much. They had great adversity. They left behind much when they formed a new church. Van Til's emphasis, though, on confessional faithfulness carries significant implications for us, even in the present day. In an era where Christianity faces myriad challenges, both from within and without, the lessons gleaned from Van Til's legacy, I believe, are crucial. We're fighting with lots of forces in our midst as churches navigate the shifting tides of culture, changing societal norms. Van Til's legacy on this point urges us, I believe, to remain steadfast to our confessional commitments, to the teaching of the Bible, thereby ensuring a continued fidelity and a vibrancy of our Christian witness now and into the future. God's word is firm. It's immovable, steadfast. His covenant is is firm. His promises towards us are sure. And he has not changed and does not change like shifting shadows. Neither does his word. And even though so many things are changing in this world, the church must remain true and steadfast to that faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. We need to guard that good deposit, and I believe Van Til would say the same, and he demonstrated as much in his own life. Confessional fidelity, that's our first lesson on Van Til. How is Van Til important for today? By teaching us how to be faithful to the confessions, to the scriptures. But secondly, we see also an important emphasis on a distinctly reformed witness. Let me get a drink of water here real quick. This is an interesting, well, this is a historian saying it's interesting, right? So like, it's interesting to me, but I think you will appreciate this too. I want to bring this to life because this is a moment in Orthodox Presbyterian history which might not be known by many of you. This is like the many different forces coming together. Like I believe Aaron Sorkin could write a really good script that would make this just sing. You wouldn't have to do much. You have all the characters. You have big egos. People going head to head over fundamental issues. This is a time we're going to learn about something called the Committee of Nine. That even sounds like a movie, I think. You see, in the decade following the formation of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, I'm talking specifically now about the 40s, there was a struggle that ensued within the young church. The battleground shifted away from what had now become the external focus of modernism to struggles within the conservative camp. So they broke away, they have their own church, so they're not fighting with modernists in their own assemblies, in their presbyteries. They're at peace on that front. Everyone there is at least a fundamentalist of one kind or another. So what do? Well, then they start to find out, maybe the enemy of my enemy isn't exactly my friend. Or you drink beer? Oh, I didn't know that. That's a problem. There's all sorts of other things that come up now because their attention is now off of fighting liberalism and looking at other theological issues. It was clear that the Orthodox Presbyterian Church was committed to maintaining a confessional faithfulness in the face of modernism, but would it be willing to maintain a distinctly reformed witness in the face of other less obvious pressures to accommodate the church to the culture? As a professor of Westminster Theological Seminary, Van Til educated generations in a comprehensive Reformed view of the world, not just a set of doctrines, but he also served in many ways, not only with his students, but with his colleagues in the Presbytery of Philadelphia and in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church as a Dutch antibody. That's great. I love this idea. So we shouldn't be opposed to this vaccine. This is a good one. But you'll see some quotes here. Charles Dennison made an apt comparison. You can look this up in History for a Pilgrim People on page 25. I've got a longer quote in my notes. I'd be happy to share it with you if you'd like. But he made this apt comparison between Van Til, R.B. Kuyper, and Ned Stonehouse, and to some degree, John Murray, the Scot, as antibodies against many others in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, namely against nationalistic and cultural dilutions of the faith. You see, Van Til challenges those because he had the influence of the Dutch heritage within him. He didn't necessarily see things the way natural-born Americans did, especially as they got caught up in the politics and in the influences in the culture. He was inoculated against some of those arguments and therefore served as an antibody to a degree within the Orthodox Presbyterian Church to save it from itself. Amidst rising secularism and theological diversity, Van Til's legacy serves, I think, as a timely reminder of the need for a robust and a distinctly Reformed and Presbyterian Christian witness. See, in the wake of Machen's death, the OPC found itself at a theological, but also at somewhat of an ideological crossroads. This tension came to a head in 1941 when the Eighth General Assembly established the Committee of Nine. The committee was tasked with examining the church's relationship with broader evangelicalism and to look more critically and soberly at its own evangelistic practices and methods. Edwin Ryan and J. Oliver Buswell were two of its members. They represented a faction within the denomination advocating for an evangelical influence and a form of what we would even call today an American Christian nationalism. Their vision was in stark contrast to the Reformed perspective that was championed by Cornelius Van Til and Murray Forrest Thompson, who was an elder at Calvary OPC in Glenside, Pennsylvania, where Van Til regularly worshiped. Just a little side note, Murray Forrest Van Til was the OPC's lawyer. Danny Olinger calls him like the consigliere. But he defended the OPC against the PCUSA when they sued us over our name. So anyway, you can look into that. And I think Bev Mariani was married Murray Forrest Thompson's son. Well, Edwin Ryan rose to prominence after Machen's death, using his position as president of the Board of Trustees at Westminster Seminary to push for a broader evangelical agenda. Ryan's influence extended widely, even out to Wheaton College, which is a significant source of early OPC ministers, and he even aimed for the OPC to join the National Association of Evangelicals, the NAE, which incidentally the PCA just left. I believe it was about a year and a half ago. Paul Woolley, who was a professor of church history at Westminster Seminary, represented an alternative vision focused on theological fidelity rather than on political influence. And this ideological divide was really encapsulated in the Committee of Nine, which also included some mediating figures, two of which were R.B. Kuyper and another man named C.A. Freitag. But despite initial optimism, the committee's tone shifted as Ryan's broader agenda became evident. So it started off as, how do we relate to other evangelical churches? And how do we think more critically about our evangelism, our evangelistic methods? And it became more like, let's become a super church. Let's become basically, what the Gospel Coalition has become, and maybe even bigger, with its own universities and everything. That's really what was behind Edwin Ryan's ideas. And that came to start to reveal itself as the committee was working. But Van Til and Thompson united in their vision for a distinctly Reformed church, not a lowest common denominator, culturally influential church. They submitted a minority report. As good Presbyterians, we know we can always protest. We can always file minority reports. You always have a voice somewhere. And they submitted a minority report at the Ninth General Assembly in 1942. This report was not merely a counterproposal, but in many ways it was a call to discontinue the committee's broader agenda altogether. I should say it was largely identical to the original report, but there were some very significant changes. And it was indeed a call to a different vision for the OPC. And that minority report ultimately prevailed. The Assembly received it and adopted it as its own report, which it sent a message, and it reinforced the OPC's commitment to its Reformed and Presbyterian roots, that the OPC in 1942, I don't think I'm stepping out on a limb here. You can ask a true historian what he thinks. But the OPC declared that day that it would be a Reformed and Presbyterian church, not a broadly evangelical church. That's how I interpret the events of 1942. The tension within the OPC was further exacerbated by external influences and internal disagreements. There were other figures like Harold Ockenga and Carl McIntyre, who eventually left the OPC. They had diverging visions that highlighted the church's refusal to align with broader fundamentalism. Additionally, the ordination of Gordon Clark became a contentious issue. Despite being fired from Wheaton College for his strong Calvinistic views, Clark supported Ryan's broader vision for the church. But the period was fraught not just with theological debates, but also questions about the church's broader identity and mission. And it serves as a picture of the OPC's struggle to define its identity while remaining faithful to its Reformed confessional roots. And Van Til served as one of the leading voices in the OPC from its inception. And it was particularly evident in 1942 on the Committee of Nine. His Dutch Reformed roots and his personal experience and heritage, especially coming down as a son of the Afscheiding, but also to a degree the Doleantie movement in the Netherlands, he offered him a unique perspective that was deeply influenced by that theological approach. And as a result, he played a crucial role in safeguarding the OPC from trends that he saw as compromising its unique voice. Van Til did not merely defend a set of doctrines, though. He advocated for a comprehensive Reformed identity that touched every aspect of life and ecclesiastical practice, one that resisted the allure of broader evangelical influence, American Christian nationalism, or any other ideological current that threatened to dilute the church's Reformed witness. And in a world that often favors theological compromise and cultural conformity, Van Til's legacy offers us a robust alternative, challenging the church to stand firm in its Reformed convictions, even when it's unpopular with the broader church, while we still may engage constructively with the world that we are called to serve. We don't have to compromise our identity, our witness, in order to engage, in order to be faithful, in order to partake and to follow the Lord in the Great Commission. What Van Til held to was really what Paul Woolley called a healthy discontent. If you haven't read Paul Woolley's article, Discontent, I highly recommend it. I can get you a PDF of it, but you can also find it online. It was published in the Presbyterian Guardian. What is a healthy discontent? Well, it measures the health of the church not by worldly standards, but by the yardstick of confessional fidelity and scriptural truth. In many ways, it's linked with what Reverend Animo is speaking about, keeping our mind focused and our eyes fixed upon the goal. Are we more interested in increasing the size of our church, increasing our budget of reading about ourselves in the papers or the internets? Or are we more interested and are we more laboring to be faithful to Christ and to see the fruits of that labor by God's grace on the day when Christ returns? I think Van Til would pick the latter. So we see Van Til's emphasis on confessional fidelity, confessional faithfulness, but also his emphasis on promoting a distinctly Reformed witness as opposed to a lowest common denominator witness. Thirdly and finally, and somewhat briefly, we'll consider also Van Til's doctrine of God. This might seem a little bit out of step with the other 2 points, but bear with me. This is important, I think, for our present historical moment. As there's been a lot of talk about Van Til lately, and there's been, frankly, a lot of confusion. And my hope is at least to lay out the landscape so that we can understand how things have become the way they have. And maybe we have a way forward in some of our polemical discussions as a result. But I really do believe that we find ourselves in a unique juncture within the Reformed Church, and also to some degree within evangelicalism. I'm thinking like the TGC circles and all that stuff. But there has been, at least of the last 10 years, maybe 15, a rising interest in Thomas Aquinas as a solution to modern theological drifts. Now, this resurgence of interaction with Thomistic thought is evident among a subset of Reformed Baptists. Just to give some examples, and I put, that's the one of the world's longest footnotes, right? I put tons of books in that footnote for you, so I'm just citing books. I'm not making stuff up. This isn't hearsay or conjecture. You can read the quotes yourself. But there has been increasing interest in Thomistic thought from folks such as a friend of mine, James Dolezal, but also Matthew Barrett. But also many Orthodox Presbyterian ministers have been interacting with and publishing on Thomas Aquinas as well. David Van Drunen, Ryan McGraw to some degree on scholasticism, Carl Trueman, and John Fesco are just some examples. Now, there are compelling reasons for this. First, the theological landscape is rife with misguided and novel interpretations of God's nature, of his being. That's evidenced very clearly, I believe, by debates over things such as the eternal functional subordination of the Son. Do you remember when that was the hot thing? Back in 2016 or whenever it was? My goodness. That is the kind of thing that is going on in evangelicalism. That is taken as, brilliant theology. It's heterodox. It's way out of step with the confessions of faith. Certainly with the Westminster, but I think also with the Nicene Creed. But these debates, I think, have exposed the theological shallowness and what's more so, the historical ignorance within evangelical churches. Secondly, though, has been a growing and a vibrant expanse of the study of Reformed scholasticism. That also is a good thing. We're thankful for that. Many more people have been studying, especially in this area, right? have been studying Reformed scholasticism to great benefit, and that's a wonderful thing. But that increased study and look into the era of Reformed orthodoxy has also led many scholars to a greater appreciation of the medieval foundations of Reformed theology. They're starting to look at the Reformers more closely, at what they were writing, yes, but who they were reading. Who were they citing? Who did they consider as important influences in the church? And that leads many people then to go consider theologians such as Thomas Aquinas, who was hugely influential. A medieval figure, hugely influential in the Reformation, yes. So, people return also to study Thomas Aquinas and interact with him because our fathers in the faith did. And in the fight against Socinianism, for example, but also other forms of theological voluntarism, where God changes and God can will himself into some other state of affairs or a different type of existence, Aquinas stands as a powerful ally with a reception also within our own tradition. So a desire to retrieve Thomistic thought on these points in order to bolster our defenses against such heterodox doctrines, that is a noble endeavor. That's a Van Tilian. You can't say I'm not a Van Tilian. You could criticize me for many things, but I love Van Til, and I think Van Til would agree with that point as well. That might be shocking to some people. Because, here's why, we're going to get a little contentious. Watch out. But yet not infrequently, this renewed appreciation for Aquinas comes bundled with criticisms of Cornelius Van Til. Why? Because he critiqued Aquinas a lot, particularly concerning Aquinas' apologetic methods and his views on the relationship between nature and grace. Those are well-known critiques. And there's a lot of discussion about whether they were accurate. And that's fair discussion. That's a discussion that ought to be had. But some argue that Van Til's unique approach to Reformed doctrines, his unique way of putting things, especially his doctrine of the Trinity, places him at odds with Orthodox theology. And that further fuels many people to go back to Thomas as well. Now, complicating this picture, if it could get even more complicated, there have been some notable theologians who also are closely linked with Cornelius Van Til, who have put forth controversial theological views. For example, and I cite, John Frame has posited a dual existence doctrine of God, that God has two existences, one that is eternal, immutable, and unchangeable, and another in which he is an agent of change within history. You can see that in his book, Doctrine of God, page numbers cited. Similarly, Dr. Scott Oliphant, in several of his books, including his now out of print, God with Us, proposed that God can assume covenantal properties, including the assumption of a covenantal mind by which he can learn and develop in relation to his creation. I have a little footnote there, which here's a quote. In condescending to relate to Adam and Eve, he is, like them, not essentially but covenantally restricted in his knowledge of where they might be hiding in that garden. So in other words, Dr. Oliphant was presenting a view in which God assumes a new covenantal mind, and according to that mind, when he asks in Genesis 3:9, where are you, with reference to Adam and Eve who are hiding, God did not know where they were, covenantally. there's a literal sense in which God is ignorant because he develops in history. That is a student of Van Til, or at least one in his tradition, who has presented an idea that is controversial, to say the least. Critics of such ideas who seek a traditional theological framework often find refuge in Aquinas' classical theism. And on the street, and I've heard this from many, but the argument seems to be from more than a few that if you follow Van Til or if you criticize Aquinas, then you must abandon classical theism. That's the argument. Well, I contend that in terms of classical theism, the perceived opposition between Van Til and Aquinas is often based on superficial or misguided interpretations of him. Probably both of them. But both theologians fundamentally agree on crucial aspects of the divine attributes, such as aseity, simplicity, and impassibility. The critiques against Van Til frequently also fail to consider that his unique formulations were specifically tailored to his particular polemical context. He was dealing with specific opponents to the faith and was articulating his doctrines in a way to address his opponents specifically. I'll give you some examples. But you can watch, we have several courses available through Reformed Forum for free, video courses if you'd like, taught by Lane Tipton, in which he goes into this in great detail. But he confronted British absolute idealism. Many of his discussions on God being one person and three persons, he's not saying that God is one hypostasis and three hypostases such that it's a logical contradiction. He's not advocating that at all, but he's using the vocabulary in many ways of the British absolute idealists to articulate a personalistic but orthodox Trinitarian theology. And likewise, he does the same when he's interacting with figures like Gordon Clark, who held to, some might say, myself included, a form of biblicistic evangelical rationalism. Gordon Clark published a book called The Problem of Evil Solved. He was a rationalist and thought that basically, philosophy was kind of a math problem. And you just think about God, and God is not three persons, so to speak, in the way that the absolute idealists thought, but for Gordon Clark, God was three bundles of thought, three centers of rationality. Van Til is dealing with that. So when Van Til says some things that are a little different, there's two things we need to note. One, he's addressing a particular polemical context, but largely, he's also reading Bavinck. And you can read a lot of Bavinck's Trinitarian theology, which he says almost word for word, many of the exact same things that Van Til gets rung up for, but everyone loves Bavinck. So how you deal with that, I don't know, but that's a thing you can look into if you'd like. I'm not here to lecture on theology specifically, but more of the historical theological angle. So let me get back to that. You see, in short, while it is valid to critique novel theological positions that are put forth by self-proclaimed Van Tilians, I really would encourage you to understand that it's a mistake to attribute these positions directly to Van Til himself. In doing so, critics risk overlooking the important areas of formal agreement. We might say, confessional agreement, and I mean by that, the Nicene Creed and the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, the agreement that we find between Van Til and Thomas at a confessional Orthodox level. They're in agreement on those things. Anyone with a basic familiarity with Van Til, I think, will have encountered, for example, his iconic two-circle diagram. Many of you have seen this. It's on all the books that are about Van Til, right? Frequently featured in his lectures in all of his courses. One might say he taught one course many different ways, right? But in all of his courses, this diagram served as a visual representation of the creator-creature distinction. He would often go to the board, draw one big circle, and then a smaller circle below it, and then he would connect them either with one line or mostly with two lines. The larger circle at the top was meant to symbolize the self-contained ontological Trinity, encapsulating a God who is wholly distinct, independent, God who is transcendent and above all creation, He does not need creation to exist. He does not change in relation to creation, but he exists of his own right, in and of himself, self-sustained, self-contained, wholly distinct, independent, and transcendent, unchanging, immutable. The smaller circle represents the entirety of creation, everything that God has made. And those two circles were connected, and that connection is represented by general and special revelation, and also by the Lord's covenant that he makes with creation, but then also specifically with his people. Van Til's theological approach is rooted in that lesson. Don't forget the diagram. When we're talking about all these different doctrines of God presently, and God that changes in some ways and not in others and all this stuff, don't lump Van Til into that group, even when so-called Van Tilians are saying those things. Van Til was all about his diagram. God does not change in relation to creation. Van Til's approach is firmly anchored in both Orthodox and Catholic, small c Catholic, theology proper. He consistently, over and over emphasized that the ontological Trinity, God as the absolute and immutable Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, serves as the foundational concept throughout his entire theology. That's all he talks about, is the self-contained ontological Trinity. This triune God, he insisted, remains immutably absolute in relation to creation and in his special acts of providential condescension. Central to Van Til's theology is his unyielding opposition to correlativism, or what he also called pantheism. Now, that sounds weird to talk about God in relation to creation being pantheistic, but this is terminology that he borrowed directly from his mentors and his colleagues, Machen and Voss. Machen talks about pantheism in lots of his books and articles. Voss talks about it all the time as well. But when reading Van Til, you can consider correlativism and pantheism as interchangeable terms. But we also see people dealing with the same issue today. In his book, All That Is in God, James Dolezal addressed what he termed theological mutualism, which I view as just another form of this same correlativism or pantheism that Van Til addressed. Van Til was an opponent. He was staunchly opposed to theological mutualism. Just in his day, he called it correlativism or pantheism. For him, let me explain, correlativism is the teaching that God and the world are submerged in mutual change and interdependency, at least in one aspect. He rejected this firmly, along with absolute idealism, particularly the versions prevalent in his time, which construed the absolute as determined by and changed in its relationship to space and time. There are many who taught, the idealists, but now in the present day, that when God enters into a relationship, he changes along with it, that he develops as an agent of history. Van Til would say, absolutely not. At no point does God enter into some sort of mutual type of existence with his creation. He is involved with creation. He directly intervenes in history, is absolutely involved in the works of creation and providence. But even as he is involved, God himself does not change. This is just orthodox doctrine of God. I hope everyone who comes for a licensure exam would get that basic point correct. And I hope all of our elders and deacons in our churches, every church member I hope would know that God does not change. Even as he interacts with us, even as he relates to us, God himself remains the same, yesterday, today, and forever. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Van Til was critical of any notion that would compromise that, and his critiques were rooted in his Reformed Trinitarian and covenantal theology, which affirms an immutable, self-contained, and triune God existing apart from the world. And that extended even to his Christology, which was also deeply rooted in orthodoxy. Van Til maintained that the eternal Son of God himself, the God-man, assumed a human nature, thus becoming the God-man. The eternal Son assumed a human nature, thereby becoming one of us. That does not introduce correlativism either. We need to get our Christology correct as well. When the eternal Son of God became man, God did not change. We don't profess that God changed at the incarnation. God did not change. He assumed a human nature. Anything that changes with respect to Jesus Christ of Nazareth, anything that changes with respect to him is attributable properly only to his human nature. His person does not change because he is the eternal hypostasis of the Son, immutable. That's important that we recognize that. This is a little contentious, or not contentious, but this might be shocking, but it is, I believe, more accurate to say Jesus is not a human person. Now, he's fully human, believe me. But we need to, for those, more advanced in theology, we need to affirm the anhypostatic and the enhypostatic union. Now the systematician in me is coming out, so we gotta rein this in. But the eternal Son of God is a fully divine person, consubstantial with the same being as the Father and the Spirit. And even when he assumes a human nature, he remains truly God. Unchanging, absolute, immutable, forever and ever and ever. But yet with this assumed human nature now, forever united to the person of the Son, he lives for us. He dies for us. He remains in the grave for 3 days, and then he's raised from the dead. He grieves for us. He prays to the Father. He learns and grows according to his human knowledge, his human mind. He has a human will that struggles with so much throughout his life, yet without sin, because he's a divine person. That's the beauty and the wonder of our Savior, Jesus Christ, and what God has done for us. We can affirm everything that we want to affirm about Jesus being one of us, sympathizing with us, being a high priest, the only way that he could, by taking our nature, dying for us so that he can intercede in our behalf with his own blood. And none of that compromises our orthodox doctrine of God. In fact, it emphasizes it all the more. Change only should be ascribed to Jesus' human nature, not to his divine nature and not to his divine person. The person of God does not change either. Van Til was firm on this, especially in his critiques against Karl Barth, who contended that Barth's Christ event construed God and man as mutually interdependent. And this, he argued, was couched in more orthodox Christian language, but fundamentally denied the concept of a self-contained triune God. His critiques were designed to protect a deeply creedal, confessional, and biblical tradition. Dr. Lane Tipton, one of my colleagues, has termed this form of correlativism as front door mutualism. To speak very plainly, maybe I will interpret my colleague for you, and perhaps I'm speaking too simplistically, but mutualism comes through the front door when God becomes a creature. When God changes to interact with us. That's front door mutualism. It's obvious, you know he's coming, he's busting down your front door, get ready. That's front door mutualism. Yet, there is another form of mutualism that we need to be wary of. And this, Dr. Tipton terms backdoor mutualism. This is the one that sneaks up on you. And this occurs when theologians propose that in one way, shape, or form, the creature becomes God. We find this in various deification doctrines in Eastern Orthodoxy, but we also find it in Roman Catholic thought, especially and often based upon Thomas Aquinas' theology of exitus and reditus, which is rooted in his theology of the divine processions. Thomas Aquinas' theology is Trinitarian from beginning to end, but it begins with exitus, an exit from God, in which the Son and Spirit proceed from the Father, but then also creation proceeds from God and goes forth, and all of his theology of anthropology, sacramentology, so his doctrine of grace and the sacraments, and then his doctrine of the beatific vision is all designed to return in reditus, to return the creature into the essence of God. Thomas Aquinas, for another day, but we need to be wary that although we are friends with Thomas on many things, we need to be wary that his exitus reditus scheme also, in my judgment, opens the back door to a backdoor mutualism. Van Til's stance is rooted in a rigorous application of Reformed Trinitarianism and federalism. And common misrepresentations of Van Til's theology frequently arise from a lack of understanding of his nuanced and consistent application of those Reformed doctrines, especially concerning the doctrine of God. But defending Van Til's position requires recognizing the coherent theological structure that underpins his critiques, as well as differentiating his views from those that he opposed. See, Van Til's doctrine of God holds significant importance for the contemporary church, both in maintaining the classical understanding of God's being and attributes, and in addressing current theological and philosophical challenges. Van Til's emphasis on the self-contained ontological Trinity serves as a robust counterpoint to modern theological trends suggesting a changeable or relational God. I'm fine with saying we have a relational God. He's relational in covenant, but he doesn't change in that relation. That's what we need to maintain. God does not become the creature in relation to us. His theology, Van Til's theology, is not merely an academic one then. It's not just an exercise for the mind, but it has enduring value in addressing our current challenges, reinforcing the enduring applicability of the faith once for all delivered to the saints in the midst of changing cultural and intellectual landscape. So in examining the life and work of Cornelius Van Til, we encounter a figure of great significance, not just to the OPC, but even to the wider world of 20th century Reformed theology and American Presbyterianism. Because through his commitment to confessional faithfulness, his dedication to maintaining a distinctly Reformed witness, and his robust approach to the doctrine of God, Van Til remained firm. He left an enduring legacy. And his work underscores the necessity of clinging steadfastly to the core tenets of the Christian faith, even when such a stance may be at odds with prevailing societal or even ecclesiastical trends. It's not always popular to do these things. And again, we might experience much pain and suffering and adversity from the world, but also maybe from other Christians. Brothers and sisters, you know the cultural and doctrinal pressures upon us are great. Every day we hear of new things. Many, even in the evangelical world, are buckling under various influences regarding biblical sexuality, or what many people would term wokeism. All of these ideas are pressing upon the church and forcing many to change. Others retreat to forms of nationalism and a worldly strongman ideology to combat the perceived cultural moral erosion. And still others see these cultural issues as fundamentally most important while turning a blind eye to heterodoxy. Well, as long as we don't become woke, so-and-so believes God changes, is it really that bad? No. We need to remain true and firm to what the Bible teaches in all regards. And while Stock, it's true, but while Stock and Van Til might presently be discounted, Cornelius Van Til's contributions should not be underestimated. And when understood and represented accurately, his work resonates with the struggles and the questions of our time, offering much-needed guidance. And as we continue to wrestle with similar issues, Van Til's voice continues to speak, reminding us of the enduring significance of confessional faithfulness, the distinctiveness of our Reformed and Presbyterian witness, and the centrality of a robust, orthodox, and uncompromising understanding of God. Thank you.
Is this being recorded? So if you're going to ask a question, I'll probably bring around the microphone to you so that we can get it. All right, here we go.
think I know the answer to this based on the things you said, but I'd just like to hear how you think Van Til would react then to this, the Christian nationalist movement.
Yes, it's interesting. I think historically it would be interesting. I haven't done this. I've read many of his letters, but it would be interesting to go to his archives and read many of his letters to see if he was interacting with the news in the 40s regarding World War II. That just came to my mind to think if he interacted with that or with many of the political forces during the First World War. So we might actually have some really interesting, forthright thoughts, comments about such things directly from his pen. But if we were just to kind of place ourselves in his shoes and based on his writings try to imagine what he might say, I think he would think that it's fundamentally misguided. I think he would appreciate the concern. I think he would empathize with some of the things that perhaps some so-called nationalists are reacting against. Yet at the same time, I think what would fundamentally win out for Van Til is something that was really taught to him by Gerhardus Voss, which would be a very strong pilgrim identity and a pilgrim ethic. And that basically is an understanding and a teaching that our home ultimately is with the Lord in the new heavens and the new earth, and that we ought to be striving toward that. Now, we strive toward that in very concrete ways sometimes, and he was, one thing that I think some Van Tilians don't want to admit is how much of a neo-Calvinist he was, especially in a lot of his letters with his nephew, Henry. He was very, very much interested in being engaged and, not as a transformationalist, so to speak, but I think he makes some of our pilgrim ethic brothers maybe a little uncomfortable sometimes to read some of those letters by Van Til. And those are the letters that theonomists love the most, right? When they read. But I think, to shorten or at least put an end to my answer, I think his heavenly mindedness would win the day, and that's, I believe, what he would start preaching or trying to convey to brothers who might have lost sight of that, who are looking for a triumph in the here and now versus looking forward to Christ returning and consummating his kingdom. I think that's probably the best answer. You're welcome, Harrison.
Thanks for everything you said. I really appreciate that. Well done. In the kind of late 1930s and then through the 40s, in Roman Catholic thought, kind of Franciscan and Jesuit thinkers are on the ascendancy. And I kind of just have this nagging question for myself, at least. Are there historical reasons why Van Til was still focused on thinking about Thomas Aquinas when there were other trends in Roman thought that were really becoming prevailing? Mm-hmm. And why was the emphasis? I mean, and maybe we don't know. I don't. But I'm hoping you might know, because I don't.
That's a great question. I don't have a strong, firm answer to know exactly why he was dealing with Thomas so much. It probably has to do a lot more with various apologists who are thinking about rationalism and thinking about the capacity of the unregenerate mind to think. And so a lot of his critiques of Thomas really start in anthropology, and he's dealing with like the donum superadditum and what happened to mankind at the fall. For Thomas, man is made in the image of God, but when he falls into sin, nothing happened to his rational capacities, so to speak. I'm being very simplistic or reduced. I'm not going into great detail here, but I think that's the real sticking point for Van Til, as far as I know. But historically speaking, I really was looking for more touch points with Van Til and modern Roman Catholicism during my PhD work. For anyone that's interested, I studied a guy named Karl Rahner, who was perhaps, you can make a case he's the most influential Roman Catholic of the 20th century. He's at least top three. He's not very popular nowadays as much as others, but if you read a lot of the crazy or unusual things that Pope Francis says, I think these are things that are very much based on a Rahnerian type of theology. So he's alive and well. But he very rarely, Van Til very rarely interacts with some of these modern Roman Catholics. He does some. I don't believe, maybe there was one citation of Rahner ever in Van Til's corpus. He might have interacted a tiny bit with Lonergan and some French or Belgian Catholics, maybe, but it's not a long, extended critique. So I don't know how much he was really versed in that or aware of it. And I think maybe the emphasis on Thomas is starting because he's teaching all these courses in apologetics. There needs to be some comparison and contrast on anthropology, especially when we're talking about a reformed image of God and a reformed doctrine of the fall. And then he's dealing with evidentialists and classical apologists and Thomas's 5 ways. I think that's probably what's driving his attention. But whether he's reliant upon other secondary sources, that'd be an interesting question to study. I'm not certain how much, he's reading Thomas directly, but the degree to which he might be imbibing secondary sources on Thomas that aren't maybe as up to date, I think, as present scholarship, that's an interesting question I'd like to know the answer to myself.
Thanks, Camden. I appreciate it. I have just a general question. How much do you think the hostility to Van Til's presuppositional apologetic masks a hostility to Van Til's Calvinism?
Could you say that again? I heard a little echo. I was missing some of that.
I was just wondering if you could comment on how much you think hostility to Van Til's presuppositional apologetic masks hostility to Van Til's Calvinism.
Thank you. Understood. I heard masks, and I thought that would going back to my vaccination joke. Sorry. I was like, what's he asking? What's Adam asking? Sure. That's a really interesting question, and you might be putting me on the spot to make some people upset. I don't know. Not everyone agrees with Van Til's apologetic approach, but I don't know if it's still the dominant one in the OPCI. I would imagine it is, but that's probably changing over the years because it's not really being taught that much in various seminaries. I do think, I'm not so sure that people are directly opposed to they're opposed to a caricature of Van Til's apologetic approach, I think, largely. Because even critics of it sometimes say, well, if you're going to find a point of contact with the unbeliever, surely it's in the image of God. Well, if you read any of Van Til's apologetic treatments, that's exactly where he points you. The Anknüpfungspunkt, the point of contact between all humanity, is the fact that we all are made in the image of God, whether we're believers or unbelievers. But it's our covenantal identity, whether we're in Christ or in Adam, that divides us fundamentally from one another, and we think differently. We have the mind of Christ. Unbelievers have a mind that's darkened in its understanding. So, last thing I'll say on this, there's a lot more we could say maybe after hours too, but you're right. I think people don't like Van Til's apologetic, and sometimes the doctrine of God, their critiques, are really just motivated because they don't like the apologetic. But I think what really bothers some people is the fact that Van Til is so popular and there's like a cult-like following. I'm not proud of that, but I love Van Til. He's one of my heroes. But the fact that so many people love him as one of their most favorite theologians, I think that is what really irritates some people. Just like when all the people in your school like the same band and you decide you have to hate them because everyone likes that band, right? I think there's a societal element to that's particularly strong in the OPC. There's just some people that can't stand Van Til getting so much attention. I don't know. Maybe I'm off my rocker here, but that's kind of, I think there's something to that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bucey, for that enlightening and edifying address tonight. So in the broader context of Van Til's and the Orthodox Presbyterian Church's emphasis on confessional consistency, faithfulness, and separation from factions that are not consistently confessional, what would you say would be legitimate and concrete expressions of Christian unity, or what I would call godly lowercase c Catholicity, with gospel faithful but non or only partially reformed Christians, churches, and denominations?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I appreciate that a lot. It almost might seem like I planted you because I talk about this all day long. I'm doing some work. It's slow going, but I've been doing a lot of work on Ned Stonehouse. Ned Stonehouse was another major figure in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, although it doesn't have the cult-like following. I'm trying to start one. I love Stonehouse, but he also is a Dutch guy from Grand Rapids, and has that dual influence of the continental tradition and being an American Presbyterian. The reason I bring him up is he did tremendous work in trying to develop a distinctly reformed ecumenicity. And his efforts were so important to the development of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. His proposals didn't ultimately win in specific instances, and then he died at a very young age. He was only 60 when he died in 1962. And when he passed, he did not see the result of his labors, that a lot of his emphases in trying to establish true unions with other denominations, trying to develop what we really see now in the OPC in terms of our ecumenical levels. We often have the highest level of brotherhood or sisterhood with a church where we maybe even exchange members, churches of like faith and practice. We might even share expenses in missionaries. We might even publish Trinity Psalter hymnals together, do all sorts of things together. So we have the closest of relationships with churches in NAPARC, for example. Stonehouse never got to see the fruition of that. And it's really what he was fighting for. So Stonehouse is an important voice on this topic. And to read a lot of his articles in the Presbyterian Guardian, which I'm working to get published as a set, that's an important place. But until then, for me to give you the short answer, concretely, I think we should do everything we can to be involved with other denominations, especially those in NAPARC and ICRC around the world. But even beyond that, do you know the people at the churches in your area? Are they a Christian church? If they're a Christian church, you mean they can affirm Orthodox doctrine, that they could affirm the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, those things. Just get to know them. You can pray with them. We're not Wisconsin Lutherans. You're allowed to pray with members of other denominations. Those are good brothers, but my goodness, they're the opposite of ecumenical, I'll tell you. I was at a wedding once, and it was being officiated by a guy, and one of my members was getting married. The Wisconsin Lutheran pastor was the officiant, and the father of the groom asked if I could pray as the OPC minister, just pray for the dinner. And the guy really had to debate about whether he could let me pray and wonder whether he was going to get in trouble with his synod if I prayed for the dinner. I'm like, this is a whole nother level. Okay. But my point is, be friends. We have Christian brotherhood with people that are not Orthodox Presbyterian or United Reformed. It's okay. And we can do things together. We can be engaged in various efforts. Our Christian school where I send my kids is a broadly evangelical school. We're involved very closely with many other Christian families. You can be involved in all sorts of other Christian efforts and ministries. You can invite them to your house, maybe even have Bible studies together. I'd encourage it to be under the oversight of somebody's session somewhere, but those are types of things, concrete things that we can and should do with other Christians beyond our walls and demonstrate that when we confess the faith on the Lord's Day, I always tell the people this when we're confessing the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed. I said, this isn't just us saying this, but it's us saying this with the Christian church around the world and with a Christian church that has said this for thousands of years. So those are little tidbits, a little emphasis on how we can do that, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Bucey, for that great talk. This might be stepping on toes, and this might be ringing back into Van Til, but what do you think Van Til would have said about the multi-perspectivalism that John Frame loves to champion? Well, him and Poitras.
Yeah. Well, I might have three answers for you. I don't know. It's a bad joke, but situationally, normatively, I'm assuming I appreciate those brothers, and Dr. Poitras was a professor of mine, a dear professor of mine, which I admire immensely. He's such a wonderful Christian man, has been so helpful to me personally. And I'm thankful for many of the insights and the fact that Dr. Frame and Dr. Poitras are seeking to address many philosophical matters from a Christian perspective. I'm not a big advocate of multi-perspectivalism. I understand, some of the concerns of why they want to do these things, and understand that truth as a whole is much broader, wider. It's not, we don't want to say it's slippery. This is not postmodernism that they're advocating for at all. But they are trying to deal with some difficult questions sometimes. And the fact that truth is not maybe simplistic and as rationalistic as like a Gordon Clark might want to say it is. I don't know what Van Til would say directly. I think he probably would hear these brothers out over many, many cups of coffee and lunches and dinners, and then he probably would criticize it and bring it eventually back to the ontological trinity. And maybe, I don't know exactly what he'd say. I suspect he would be somewhat critical in the ways that other Van Tilians have been of multi-perspectivalism, but I think he would be very charitable about it, about his disagreement. For anybody who's interested, Van Til, I've got a letter in which he was indicating he had Gordon Clark to his house, I think, for 5 hours at least. They had him over to his house over and over just to talk to him about his theology. So this idea that Van Til was somehow just out to get Clark unfairly is completely a falsehood. Yeah, thanks.
Concerning Van Til's creator-creature diagram, how would you assuage someone's fears if they thought the bigger circle might be a second commandment violation?
Oh, the circle itself
represents God, right?
You're right. It's a drawing. Well, if they have a matter of conscience, I would talk to them about it, but I'd respect it, I suppose. I wouldn't necessarily try to convince them. I don't think the intention is so much to draw God as it is to use a line to demonstrate something about God. So, okay. Let me throw it back to you. Does writing the name of God, that represents God too? Is that a drawing of him? I mean, I don't mean to be pejorative, but I'm saying if that's a genuine, heartfelt, conscious objection, then who am I to bind your own conscience? Then I don't want to cause a brother to stumble. But again, I don't think Van Til is drawing God that he thinks God looks like a circle. He's just demonstrating that God is self-contained and trying to have a visual way to represent that. Yeah.
All right, let's thank Camden for his lecture.